Max, how have things been?
Good, man. Stressful and exciting. And I feel like the two emotions are often one and the same.
Hmm. What's top of mind?
Growing and dreaming bigger. And I think that what we can do is largely a function of what we believe we can do. Partially because of woo-woo manifestation shit, but primarily because when you believe you can do something different, you start to take different actions,
Hmm.
and that drives different results.
Hmm. What do you think is the number one way in which people limit their ambition?
They surround themselves or listen to people who belittle their ambition.
Hmm.
I think that 99% of people belittle ambition, and that means that on average, when you ask people for advice, or on average, the people you're around are going to bring you down.
Hmm.
That's the nature of average. And I think that we are quite mimetic, and as a result, we can lean into mimesis by surrounding ourselves by others who also want to lift the scale of ambition, and
Hmm.
by
Interesting.
insulating ourselves from those who do the opposite, which is belittle ambition.
This idea of leaning into mimesis and using it as an advantage rather than something that you just avoid is actually pretty clever. Um, why do you think society in general developed this meme of belittling ambition?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think that evolutionarily there was uncapped downside, aka you could die, and there was capped upside. Like if you were a hunter gatherer, let's be real, you're gonna kill 10 deers or like one deer. It doesn't make a difference. You're still gonna
Hmm.
eat.
Hmm.
Whereas being too ambitious in hunter gatherer times could kill you. So I
Interesting.
think part of it is potentially Darwinian. And I think the way that shows up is fear. I think that fear evolved for the 59,000 years of human existence that were different to the last 1,000 years
Hmm.
of human existence. Then potentially there's potentially there's envy. I don't know.
Hmm.
Potentially it's competitive. I'm sure there are other reasons for it that I'm not thinking about.
I think, with the exception of fear of physical danger, um, almost all fear is unfounded, and most of the ways in which you would act probably wouldn't be different in the negative if you didn't have fear. So what I mean by this is the reason I don't crash a car into the wall is not because I'm afraid. It's because I just don't want to crash
100
it.
miles an hour. Here we
Like
go.
like I said physical fear for a reason. Oh, um
People are looking at us. Okay, reset.
um yeah, like
um,
the reason I don't just like
yeah.
insult a random person online is not because I'm afraid of the repercussions, it's just because that's
Mhm.
not what I want to do. Um
Yeah. I yeah, I think that on average we should try to reduce fear, and I think probably more bad things. I think more fear is probably irrational than rational. I do wonder where fear is, like where perfectionism and seeking perfection can be a useful trait. I think the world where it's a useful trait is where it results in. I think that most things, like 9 out of 10, is 10 times better than 8 out of 10, which is 10 times better than 7 out of 10. And I think sometimes fear can be an impetus for someone to seek greatness versus just settle for mediocre. And I think it's one of those paradoxes where the right formulation is simultaneously be very low fear and have high standards.
hmm.
And the goal is having them both at the same time versus just one or the other. There are a lot of people with zero fear with very low standards because they don't give a shit about how something's perceived or how high quality it is. Um, and then there are people with really high standards but really high fear, and they just don't ship at all. They just sit there
Hmm.
twiddling their thumbs and talking about doing rather than actually doing.
I think this idea that the closer you are to perfection, the more of the power law of the rewards you get. For example, being the best leads to a lot more win than being the second best, which leads um, to a lot more winning than being the third best, etc. That being said, where I think people get trapped is in aiming for perfection as step one. And what ends up happening is you get stuck in the bottom of a very deep J curve. And most of the time, you don't have the resources to gun right for perfection. Occasionally you do, but a more sensible approach is likely a bunch of smaller J curves with perfection as the end goal in mind. And so this is not taking the YC indoctrination approach of radical iteration without any form of long-term vision or directionality. And it's not taking the sort of founders fund approach, which is gun for perfection, ultra capital intensive, deep J curve for dozens of years, and then
but I think Founders Fund actually strikes the balance really well. Like Peter strikes the balance very well. He's a fearful person by nature, and he's quite perfectionist by nature. He believes that curves are convex rather than concave, and yet he can also take risk. Right? PayPal shipped a lot of things that were not bulletproof. Right? PayPal shipped a lot that was broken. They burned a lot of money. They lit a lot of things on fire. And I think Founders Fund does, in many ways, champion that philosophy. Tesla being a great example. Now, the goal of Tesla was to be the best, right? Yeah. The goal was bold and big and convex, but at the same time, Tesla ships cars with non-production parts. And they're like, well, we'll just change them when we do a service, and no one will know we shipped cars with non-production parts. So yeah, hold on, I'm not gonna turn around. I think this is a cemetery here. Okay, now let's keep driving. I also think that it reminds me a little bit of your idea of static friction versus dynamic friction. And static friction is you're stuck, you're not moving, whereas the goal is actually start moving and then learn along the way. I also think that in many ways, the way to get to perfection is by doing things and fucking up versus the inverse. I actually think that there's a correlation between how perfect something is and the number of fuck ups that thing has had on the way of getting there. And the second you internalize that, you start to realize, oh, okay, now fuck ups are actually an input into getting to perfection. And the canonical study here was the one with two groups who were each instructed to take the best photo they could. One was told, they were instructed different things. One was told, take the best photo you can, and the other group was told, take as many good photos as you can. And the ones who took as many good photos as they could ended up taking the best photos of all of them.
This makes sense. I wonder. Yeah, I guess the analogy here would be like if you're trying to get as much cream as possible, get as much milk as you can, and therefore you have like the most volume of like maybe not that analogy, but it's just this constant fight, I think, between quality and quantity. And the point you're making is valid, which is quantity breeds quality. Because it's very hard to have a smart person do stuff and not naturally try to improve the system. So I think if you're smart and if you're strategic and if you desire perfection, you should just do things because you will accidentally make things perfect. In fact, maybe accidentally is not the word, but you will compulsively make things perfect.
Yeah, I very much agree. I just think that often you earn the insights on how to improve by leaping and then solving things along the way. I think that a lot of people create false requirements. They say, well, we need to do X, Y, Z before we can actually do the thing. And that means they never learn how to do the thing. Part of this is the Mr. Beast formulation. I remember hearing someone ask Mr. Beast, how would you advise someone starting out today think about creating content? And Mr. Beast said, I recommend, he's like, the only thing I'm going to say is this. I recommend for the next 50 days, record one video a day and make sure every subsequent video is a little bit better than the previous one. And like, the irony is how many people who listen to that actually followed that. I contend just about no one. And I'd contend that if someone followed that, they'd actually be creating pretty damn good content by day 50.
I've noticed this firsthand when it comes to creating momentum in any projects that I've done. If I'm thinking about the optimal pathway, I actually think that creates more static friction, because what happens when you create a perfect plan is you continuously increase the bar for what you need to do to get a full cycle completed. And if you massively decrease that bar, I think you actually start getting momentum, getting wins, and as a result, it's able to attract more resources towards something. One of the ways in which I've seen this happen is particularly with pursuits that are creative and that require you to stake your identity on the line. And that's where I think people get the most perfectionistic. Podcasting may be one example of those things where people are like, I'll do it, but I need this like perfect studio setup and this these perfect camera lenses. And
well, I swear I said to you, we're not recording a podcast now, and you're like, oh no, I'm just testing the camera, and I think this is maybe going to become a podcast.
Interesting.
Let's say.
But I feel that way to an extent with music, where I'm like, okay, I need like the perfect songwriting structure done and the perfect like beat that I want to do things to, and I want to do it with the perfect mic and the perfect studio, and I need to align all of these things just to make a single song.
So the thing I often do now when wanting to write a article or a LinkedIn post or something is I'll hop in Slack and I'll pull up just a random person on our team and I'll start typing a message to them. And I'm not actually going to send the message. This is actually how I draft. But in my head, somewhere psychologically, I think I'm just typing a message. And as a result, I'm not thinking about, is my mindset perfect? Do I have enough time? Am I focused? Do I feel the creative juices flowing? No, I'm just sending them a message. Obviously, I can send them a message. And it's nearly always the first draft. And the second I have the first draft, now I'm in the world of dynamic friction rather than static friction. I'm moving, I'm taking action. And guess what? The draft gets edited. And then it becomes a post and the post gets posted. So I think this is a version of almost like realizing that my psychology is wired to want to do things really well, and then looking at how to wire it slightly differently. People do not know how to drive around here.
But they're so cute.
Yeah. I got road rage.
Are you
think they're cute? No, I'm Max GPT.
One of the things I think I've noticed over time is that the market for attention does not reward perfection to the extent that we think it does, but it rewards resonance. And one of the ways maybe we've seen this is when we look at
what do you mean by that?
So the difference between perfection and resonance is, I think resonance feels like raw and authentic and almost like off the cuff. The thing that made me realize this is like looking at a lot of musicians perform, and even some of the ways that their vocals sound, they're not perfectly tuned. They're a little bit gritty. There's like a raw element to them. It's almost intentionally just human. And when we think about media that tends to be resonant, I think it's not like perfect cinematography. It's often just like the more like resonant media. Paul Graham's essays, for example, I don't even think he has like HTTPS on his domain. It feels like it was just like a smart guy that's just posting. And something about that feels very real. Whereas sometimes when I see like VCs posting,
could that be perfection? Like it takes a lot. It's the idea of that. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. Which is that sprezzatura actually takes time.
Perhaps, but it's not perfect. It's not polished. It's raw, and raw can be very difficult. And I think that like rustic presentation, if we were to call it that, would be pretty compelling.
Yeah, I just think in a world where there's lots of things selling to us, there's lots of things vying for attention, there's the ability to make things look good via agencies and AI. the things which do the inverse capture attention.
Yeah.
I think there's almost like this return. At the start of the year, I wrote like ins and outs for 2025. I'd be curious if you have a list as well. And um, I wrote heritage, and like vintage is an in.
Mm.
And I think part of that is just the natural cycles of culture, but I think part of it is almost a revolt against the perfection and perfect images
Mhm.
and everything being too slick
Yeah.
on online.
Yeah, interesting.
But I don't know. There's like kind of a barbell. Like I actually do believe that the content that performs best sits in. I think it has to feel like real or effortless, or like very very effortful. I think that's the barbell, right? Like super high production quality content, Jason Carmen style, um, like really elite, or it has to feel like someone hardly even put any thought into it.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I think that's the barbell. I think we kind of see this on Twitter. Like many of the things that perform well now are like all lowercase because
Yeah.
it feels stream of conscious. Now the irony is those things are often staged rather than stream of conscious, and I sense that the algorithms kind of reward that. I don't know, and yeah, but maybe.
Hmm. I think if you asked most people to make something and they could have perfect resources and perfect production value, they would choose perfect production value. If you asked the most legendary artists, they would intentionally dial the production value down. And so I think there's a bit of this midwit curve, which is like ship stuff that's real, ship stuff that's perfect in the middle, ship stuff that's real at the end. And even if we look at some of the most captivating moments in media,
Well, look at Tesla's marketing.
yeah,
Right, like marketing probably sits in a barbell on like a midwit curve as well here, which is casual, sprezzatura, broken, human led,
yeah.
then perfect, and then we come full circle on the other side.
I think with warfare we see the same thing where you have like unorganized guerrilla warfare as the sort of left end of the midwit curve, perfect strategy and like military execution in the middle, and then rogue guerrilla warfare at the end as well. Um, and when we think about the moments that captured the most, again, not perfection but resonance, it was never Musk's keynotes that captured the public attention. It was actually the failure with throwing something onto the Cybertruck shield that had resonance. It was him smoking a joint on Joe Rogan's podcast that had resonance. And the goal of media, I think, should be capture the heart of the public and capture the genuine interest of the public, not just
the wrong way.
Whoops. Not just have someone say like, "Oh yeah, that was pretty. Like that was a great shot." Like yes, it can sound pretty, but did it hit?
I wish we could turn the camera around so it could see where we're going. This is actually really high production quality content.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Like this is going to be a Steven Spielberg style shot coming up. I don't even know if the camera knows what's coming up. But if you watch to the end of this podcast,
Remember, click the bell icon.
You won't believe how the podcast ends. Okay, with a car crash.
Oh, wow.
It's a sketch. Multitasking time.
That being said, there's a part of me that does love when things are absolutely perfect. And when things are just like crisp and beautifully designed and every single little detail is thought of. Almost that Apple product feeling of just perfection in the product.
Yeah,
It's
I
very
think there's a
satisfying.
rationality sometimes in artistic perfection that is kind of rational. For example, I was having this debate with someone in the Cone Superpower the other day, and we were talking about some of the investments we make in brand and how his take was, but I haven't seen the like ROI because he's looking for like attributed short-term ROI, and I'm like, sure, like if you take a short-term 5% of the payoff curve, which is what any test shows, I kind of agree with you.
Mm.
There's no ROI, particularly if you're only capturing the one variable of attributed customers.
Yeah.
But if you capture the full set of variables and you don't just look at the short term first 5% of the payoff curve, but you look at the 95% over the long term, well, there's maybe more going on. And I started to think about what are some examples in the world of things that are irrational and understandably irrational, but actually potentially make sense. And Apple and Amazon were two of like several companies that came to mind. The first example with Apple, obviously, is making the internals of the computer symmetrical and neat. But then the second example is their Bezier curve. So the radius, the corner radius on Apple's hardware, the iPhone, the AirPod case, the MacBooks, is all the same. And it's a unique curve called the Bezier curve.
Mm-hmm.
And when Johnny Ive, I believe it was, invented it, everyone at Apple said, this is stupid. We're going to have to redo all of our machines. There's no machines in the entire world which follow this corner radius. It's going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. And they did it. I was speaking with someone who's an architect at Apple. They're like, I was designing a tampon dispenser for the women's bathroom and it had to follow the Bezier curve. Right? And there's no manufacturing for it. So they had to build their own manufacturing to make a fucking tampon dispenser for the Bezier curve. I was like, where is the ROI in that? Where's the rationality in that? But I think as a result, Apple has this like artistic feeling. And Jeff Bezos' formulation of this was take professional pride. Right? Yeah. And he's like, we just got to take professional pride with the small things because no one else will. Yeah. And I think, yeah, you go.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a cultural, it's this, the values in that story that you just told, which is the cultural implication of doing something like that, which is we care about artistic integrity. And while that may have been financially not a smart decision as an individual decision being made, held in isolation, the ripple effects of that story across the culture of the organization is one that tells the team we care about making things beautiful, even if it costs us money. And as a result, I think if you were to check the market cap of Apple versus Microsoft, maybe Microsoft's winning, maybe Apple's winning, I don't know. Microsoft's probably winning. But if you were to ask someone, Apple versus Microsoft.
So on this, I was at a conference in December last year, and the speaker said to everyone, make the sound that comes to mind when you think of Microsoft. And everyone's like, And then the speaker said, make the sound that comes to mind when you think of Apple. And everyone gets up and starts cheering, right? And it was like, that's how people so feel, powerful. Right? And look, maybe Microsoft is bigger because of other strategic decisions they made. That's different. That's the level of strategy more so than can you create the emotion in people. I'd probably contend that if Microsoft also had its pulse on consumer emotion, they'd maybe be even bigger than they are.
It's more than what's on the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ represents financial capital, but you need to account in the value of a company, the cultural capital. And
well, I think in the limit, cultural capital is priced in. And
agreed.
I think that very few people make decisions based on what's true in the limit because it's just very hard to price. And we live in a world of rationality, and that when decisions are put to consensus, the way to come to a resolution is through logic and numbers, right? And I think this is why many great products are actually run by dictators. Steve Jobs was a dictator. Elon is a dictator. And as a result, you can create great products because you can make irrational decisions that feel right rather than look right in on paper. But it's really hard to do that because, like, it's hard just from, like, how do you get a team around a decision that is not logical? Like, how are people going to rally around that? How are they going to be brought in? It's tough.
So how do you circumvent logic without power?
I think that a big part of it is education. Writing memos on this, communicate. Like, when people actually hear this chain of reasoning and they see the examples and they hear the anecdotes, they start to understand how and why this can make sense, and it can start to become part of culture. So I do think sharing the why behind something is really effective. Versus if you just jumped right to the conclusions without sharing the why, you acted in dictator mode, you made irrational decisions, you're very quickly going to lose the the support and the rapport of the team.
Mm.
I also think that it becomes easier as the company gets larger. And it also requires someone to be low fear and be willing to be disliked. I remember someone who worked at Canva saying to me, oh, the most annoying thing is like the whole product team will work on a product and then Mel Perkins, the founder, comes in and says she doesn't like something and change it. It's like, who does Mel know? She didn't have any context. I'm like, well, hold up a sec. Mel has made like the right decision time after time after time for 7 years. And she has 7 years of context, basically living and breathing this. I actually think maybe her intuition's right. And when you're at Mel's canvas scale, you can do that because even if one person disagrees and leaves, it doesn't fundamentally harm the company. And she has a track record, right? So I think in the limit, these things tend to work themselves out.
One thing I'll disagree with is I don't think the scorecard should be how many times has that person made the right decision, and as a result, that person should get more decision-making authority. There's a few reasons for this. One, it should not be about the number of right decisions. It should be when a decision is made that's extremely right, what are the rewards of it? That's one thing. But the other thing is, what's more important than it being the right decision is it being, from an expression standpoint, correct. So if I was to evaluate investing in two venture firms, for example, one with a good portfolio, one with a bad portfolio, I would probably overwrite that and say which portfolio feels like it has the soul of the investor, which product feels like it has the soul of the person creating it. Because if that's the case, that's a much more like enduring form of creating something, because it becomes an artistic project for them, not just like a rational means to an end. And that, I would say, is the number one thing differentiating Apple from Microsoft. Microsoft is right all the time, but Apple is art.
Yeah, it's do you think do you think that this means that the actual answer is just bet on? It's really interesting. Amazon has this cultural principle. They've got 12 leadership principles, and one of them is leaders are right often. That's the fucking leadership principle, right? It's like, well, how do you grow into the idea of leaders are right often? And what it's trying to capture is this idea that some people are just like right more often, and we tend to see that over time, and we will value that. But yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind is the extent to which this primarily just depends on the founder being really, really good versus whether it's possible to actually create a company where expression is more distributed. I do think the latter is possible. I just think it's very hard. I also think that people are chronically underempowered, but I think that the implication of empowering someone more is that they're going to fuck up, and I think so few people are like willing to take a few fuck ups in favor of. It's kind of what you're saying, which is don't judge the fuck ups. Judge if every so often something wildly pays off. And I think that kind of culture is supportive of expression that's distributed versus expression that's centralized. I do think there are ways to like systematically incentivize this. I think of the company Mischief as an example. Every month they do a viral marketing drop, basically subversive art that also allows them to make money by virtue of how viral it becomes. And they say anyone within the company can have an idea, and we put every single idea we receive into a big backlog, and then in 6 months' time we assess them. Right, not right away. It's like in 6 months, and if in 6 months we still find the idea exciting, then we'll explore it. We'll conduct feasibility. We'll assess it, and if we still find it exciting, we'll put the idea on for a year from now. Right. So 18 months from the idea being conceived, they actually plan to execute on it.
Interesting.
But what that allows is for anyone to have any idea, and by the time that period comes, their ego is detached from it. Now it's people actually just like rationally assessing the ideas that come from anywhere versus cutting them down right from the start because of politics or imperfect judgment.
That's very clever. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for how Mischief has created a system of creativity. There's this idea of like,
Mm.
well, it's art and you can't systematize art. I don't know. I think it's hard to systematize art, but I do think that it's definitely possible to do so. And I think often people just are not given the empowerment or the reins to create art. One thing I think about is there are often employees who within a company don't do that great work and they leave and they create their own thing and the work is really great.
Mm.
And one explanation for that is like agency problems. But I think another explanation is that companies don't empower people to actually fully self-express.
Mm.
And as a result, they reach a local optima versus the global optima.
Hmm. I increasingly think that founders very closely map to pop stars. Um, I know this is something you know I think pretty often, but the best founders have a cult-like following and an ability to express themselves through their work and make their work their identity in a way that maps so closely to what a pop star does. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think for some people that is authentic to them and they would feel incomplete without making their work themselves. And it's okay to make your identity your job if the way you're like doing the work is an expression of your identity. And so it's not that you're making your whole identity X company. It's that X company is your identity, and that's the expression of it. And one of the things I think people get wrong is that there's more suffering in not having a vehicle through which to express yourself than it is having your entire identity attached to a vehicle.
Hmm. What do you think is like the most accurate analogy for founders? I've heard founders as also I have no idea how to get out of Sausalito. But anyway, I'll work it out. No GPS.
All right.
It spoils the fun, and then we don't learn how to actually drive and navigate San Francisco Greater Bay Area. What do you think is the most accurate analogy for a founder? I've heard of a founder as an artist, a founder as an athlete, a founder now as a pop star. I guess all of these, in certain respects, of us have things in common. I think the founder as an artist and pop star have this idea of like emotion and creation. I suspect the founder as an athlete is slightly more related to relentlessness and competitiveness and work ethic. I almost think that I also almost think it's a blend. Like I think that there are some people strongly in the athletes camp, and there are some people strongly in the like artist camp, and I wonder whether it's like both. And yeah, no, I think the athlete version is like running away from something, and the artist version is running to or moving towards something. And I think that there's been a lot of dogma in Silicon Valley of founders are running away from trauma, which I think is partially true. But I think that over a longer period of time, the moving towards something is like equally true. I contend that Elon, yes, runs away from things, but also moves towards things. I'd say that Steve Jobs primarily moves towards something versus ran away. Yeah, anyway, all those analogies. Curious if you think there's actually any wisdom in there or something worth indexing towards.
I don't interface with too many athletes, but I think that art is more about reconciling and leveraging trauma, or it's almost just something you do as a result of trauma. It just happens. There's
Do you think most people are traumatized? Like
I don't know, but I know there's a deep
Yeah.
stoicism associated with athletics.
hmm,
Whereas
artists aren't that stoic, are they?
they're not. They're emotional, right?
Yeah.
Which is why I
They're
think
neurotic.
there's a neuroticism. There's like an instability, an emotional kind of there's a really deeply human expression.
Hmm.
And I think there can be human expression through sports, but not in the lens that when someone says a founder's an athlete, what they mean is like the resilience, the consistency, the rigor, the work ethic, discipline, all of those attributes. I think real athletes are actually artists and that there's so much soul in what they're doing. Um, I don't think the best founders, the first thing I would say about them is yes, they work very hard. Like a lot of people work very hard. Um, Working hard is downstream of caring a lot about something, or downstream of like a lot of discipline. I think the best founders work hard because they care. They don't work hard because
Yeah, I grapple with this. Like I don't. So let's assume that like at a minimum, everyone who does great things has to work 80 hours a week. I think that's
yeah,
like pretty fair.
yeah,
Um, the thing I grapple with is whether going from 80 to 110 actually drives delta, and whether actually very few people do that. I don't know. I do tend to think that going from 80 to 100 is quite important. I think the reason why a lot of hardworking people, though, who do work 100 hours don't get anywhere is that they don't have the time to they don't spend the time to point in the right direction. I think there's a lot of like blind working hard. And I think that um, a year spent working hard on the wrong thing is kind of like a year wasted. So I think the right formulation is like you need to work super, super hard and you need to be super strategic and point in the right direction. And because of how rare greatness is, because of how low probability greatness is, it kind of makes sense that you have to be good at everything rather than just like primarily good at one thing.
Hmm. I think the people that fill their entire day up with work, the main benefit is not that all of their time is allocated towards work, but it's that there's no time not allocated towards work. And those are a little bit different because the fact that no time is allocated not towards work means your brain doesn't go anywhere else.
Yeah.
And so even in a second of pause, your brain is going to think about all the things that were happening in the seconds of not pause. Whereas if you're working 80 hours and then you're filling up the other 30 with something else, now your brain is processing both the 80 hours of work and the 30 hours of non-work or whatever you want to call it. And so I think it's less about the output that comes from the additional hours as much as it's about the obsession.
I think that's really, really well said. And it's interesting, like I think the like a lot of the founders you and I know, we almost feel as if they're not super, super hardworking because the nature of work for them doesn't necessarily look like work. It looks like dining out. It looks like going to an event. Um, and the reality is every single minute of their lives is work. Like
Yeah.
every single thing they do is dedicated to like listening to a podcast is work. Exercising to them is still a form of work. Like
Yeah.
everything is work. But they found a lot of ways in which it is different to just being a monkey behind a keyboard. I think the the form of hard work which is monkey behind a keyboard is probably inversely correlated with success because that tends to not be the highest leverage work compared to other things that people can do.
I would love to see a San Francisco where 2 days of the week we're not allowed to use laptops, but we still work. What would we do?
It's not going to be better because like I think this again we're like San Francisco you got to remember is still like a median or a mean and the average the reason some people get away with being at the dinner rather than behind the laptop is because most people are behind the laptop. Now, potentially AI changes this. Potentially AI creates a world where being behind your laptop is less valuable than meeting people and thinking about things, but for most roles, not just for founder roles. I think that's maybe interesting.
Hmm.
Also, how cool is this drive?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I never properly seen Sausalito.
Yeah, it's stunning, man. It
Like,
reminds me of the uh like Riviera
it's like,
area.
yeah, it reminds me of like the shittiest parts of Sydney. No, but like actually, like Sydney is amazing, and this like is getting close to the average in Sydney, which is really rare. No, no. Jokes aside, it is really stunning. I'd only seen parts of Sausalito, and yeah, it's beautiful. I find it really inspiring moving through beautiful areas. Like this is like motivating in a way. I was quite stressed earlier today from this like big superpower deal making and product and growth questions and memos, and I feel quite relaxed, just like driving and testing out whether audio recording works on a phone. This is not a podcast. And driving through Sausalito.
Mm. Driving is very
Oh,
special.
damn, I should have gone down there. That would have been better. Yeah, it's like crazy to think that. Like, think about how dangerous this is from a 1900s perspective. We, as humans, with kind of mediocre motor skills, driving big metal boxes at 100 miles an hour. Like, it's kind of what, and we're doing that whilst only being like feet from each other and driving in these narrow lanes, and all it takes is to lose focus. That's wild.
It's pretty dangerous,
It's pretty-
especially when I'm driving.
This is why you're not driving. Let's see if we can get up to Mount Tam. What do you want to jam on?
I can't get this idea out of my head of the importance of integrating with nature and the physical world and with each other.
Yeah.
I just obsess over it because it's something I've denied for so long. And by accident, I've been forced into the position where I have to interact with nature.
Yeah.
And the way it's impacted me has been tremendously positive. I think there are things about the Bay Area cultural operating system that can be updated. Primarily, I think we need to shift away from technicality more into emotion and art. We are going to get tremendous amount of technical leverage.
Yeah.
And one of the ways people might think about using that is, oh yeah, layer more technical leverage with these technical tools to achieve even more insane outcomes. This idea of integrating with nature, integrating with other people, and the staunch resistance of the polymath, I think is going to be necessary for another Renaissance. The thing I keep thinking about is, why is it that in the Renaissance you had this like Renaissance mad person, whatever you want to call it, develop? Why did that happen? And if that's the case, why is it that now we expect people to focus, do one thing, and this hypermanic, tunnel vision-esque view of the world was not the way the greatest civilizations were built? Whether it's ancient Egypt or Greece or the Renaissance, they were polymaths across these different time periods, completely disconnected from each other, and those were the times when we had the most societal development. It's only in the Bay Area where I think this idea of radical focus is extremely rewarded, and I would hope that we shift the culture away from radical focus and towards just be great, just be obsessed with everything, be obsessed with anything, do things at the highest level, but don't do just one thing, because I don't think that's the best way to create things.
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking at the background of many of the people who have created great things. Paul Graham, the techno king, was a painter. Steve Jobs drew inspiration from calligraphy. Peter Thiel and Mike Moritz was a journalist, and Peter Thiel studied philosophy. And there was this interesting tweet that went viral yesterday that said something along the lines of, "Look, all of the people who are successful do lots of different things. They're interested in like hiking and this, and they're builders who ride." And then there was like a retweet which I thought was funny. It was like, this is called basically people having different interests, and like actually kind of true. And I think that again, because it's so hard to do anything great, it's the intersection of lots of unusual things all done obsessively that result in greatness. So yeah, I tend to agree. I think that isn't necessarily opposed to the narrative of focus. I think the reason the narrative of focus is powerful is one, compounding and convexity, right? Like the spending 9 hours on a thing can actually that could drive way more output than 6 hours on a thing. Like that's actually true. Like they're often aren't diminishing returns with investment. There's often increasing returns with investment. The curve is convex rather than concave. I think the other reason there's this narrative of focus, maybe, I don't know, but maybe is because of incentives. And the incentive is for the top founders and for VCs to be diversified, and for all the people that the VCs invest into to only be supporting the VC versus anything else. I doubt that incentive actually trickles down to that degree, but I do find it interesting. I just think that great people do lots of things, and that's just the reality. And there's no real like way around that. But okay, hectic merge.
You recently
yeah.
sent me the bookshelf of Patrick Coulson.
Yeah, wild.
And the thing
Yeah.
that
How does he have time to read that?
first off, how does he have time to read that?
Like,
But also, why did he read such a wide range of things if arguably none of these things are useful to Stripe?
Yeah.
And
yeah,
maybe he just did because he's curious. Maybe he just did because it enriched him as a person.
Mhm.
Maybe he just did knowing that it wasn't useful and he did it anyways. But
Bill Gates is the same, man. They're all the same. They all read. They're all interested in lots of things. They read lots of things. They focus. Like I think that the interdisciplinarity of ideas and the outcome of that on thinking is really powerful, but very hard to price using any short-term ROI calculation. And because again, the world is like short-term ROI maximizing, and using variables that are well understood and mechanisms that are well understood, we conclude that, focus. Don't do any. If you're reading a book that is not related to your thing, that's a distraction.
Yeah.
Right now, you actually just think the pricing mechanism the world is using is wrong.
Mm-hmm. If we're pricing things quarter to quarter, focus makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you're pricing things as a society, you need more enriched people to create more meaning and to do things better. And that comes from periods of radical focus, but also giving people the time to be polymaths. And I think great leaders are polymathic. We need more great leaders. We need people with more well-rounded opinions. Actually, I'm going to take back the term well-rounded. The thing to avoid here is we don't want generalists. We actually want polymaths. And those are distinct things. The people that I know that are generalists are kind of bad, are kind of okay at everything. The people I know that are polymaths, I could see them doing anything. They could do everything. They're exceptional at every single one of the verticals. And the problem that they have is, what do I do versus what am I actually good at? For those people, I urge them, I compel them, do everything. Do literally everything that you can up until you have no more energy. Do it with a lack of focus, do it with intensity, do it with passion, and let yourself naturally be drawn to the thing that, like, where your energy wants to go, because that will just naturally happen. Whereas I think the restrictive, like, top-down approach of like, this is what I'm doing, I'm going to avoid everything else, I think stifles creativity. And creativity is a lot more important than focus in the upcoming 10 years, for sure.
The thing that I often say to people who are trying to work out what to do with their lives is, what do you assume anything you're going to do is anything you do works? Where do you see yourself in 20 years? And I think it's far easier to predict what you want to do in 20 years or 30 years than 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. Because we are able to dream and think slightly less about, again, short-term ROI. And I think the reality is, for talented people, anything they do will work. Particularly if they really, really care about it and they're really, really obsessed with it. What's your answer? Where are you going to be in 20 years? I already know what you're going to say. Actually, maybe I don't. Assume anything you do is going to work. Like, what do you want to be doing in 20, 30 years?
Everything. Like, I just want to do a bunch of stuff.
It's not everything. It's like probably 5 things really, really, really well. And that's the polymath versus generalist.
That's the thing. I think if you tell me I actually don't want to do everything, there's maybe 2 or 3 things I want to do.
Totally.
And
that's polymath rather than generalist. The generalist is everything. The polymath does a very small number of things, but very well.
Yeah. I think I would bucket it into, it's just art, science, and investing. Um, Really, I need to have like a creative. I think the important thing is to not subjugate any of these things to each other, and to hold those things in balance. So I want my artistic pursuit to be taken just as seriously as my scientific pursuit, to be taken just as seriously as my investing pursuit. And those three things I'm like focused on. Now, there's things that I don't really care if they happen or not. For example, I don't really need to have a family. I don't really need to have kids. I I would be willing to forego a relationship for those things.
You've just cut the dating market by 95%.
But
That's
yeah.
right. No girls are gonna listen to this podcast.
Oh my god. But if you are, ladies, exceptions can be made for the right one. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to ask people what are things they would be willing to sacrifice. Time is finite. There are laws of physics that we need to abide by. And I don't think it's possible to have more than 3 projects. And I do think a relationship counts as a project. I know there's the argument that relationships can be enriching and empowering and supportive of the main thing you're working on.
I do think they can be. I do think if you, so the thing that I thought about recently is that if you get into the relationship at a point, oh fucking traffic. How do we get out of this? Okay, I'm into HIV. If you get into the relationship at a point in time where you're already really underwater and you already don't have much time, and the relationship is supportive and enriching during a very intense period, then I think it's quite safe to assume that it can continue to be supportive and enriching. I think where they often fall apart is you get into a relationship at a lull during your life or a sabbatical year, and then all of a sudden you go back to long hours, obsession mode, and the girl's like, "Oh, what happened?" Or I think the other way it can be toxic was basically like my first relationship, which was I was working very hard, and the year it was my last year of high school, and the year after I was taking a year off. I was calling it a working gap year, but I think my girlfriend didn't actually believe that I was going to take a working gap year. And then when I kept working, she's like, "Wait, what the fuck?" And that's when it can be bad as well, right? When you're working very hard, but they're not actually supportive and enriching through the hard work period, or they're waiting for what comes after. They're like, "Oh, he's working hard now, so he can like chill a little bit later." And it's like,
yeah,
nope, that's not how it works.
yeah,
yeah.
Yes, that's actually a really good point.
So I do think it can be supportive and enriching. I do think that's true, and I think they're enough. I just think if you if you did correlation analysis on this, I think that it would be like positively correlate, like relationships early in life would be positively correlated with if you just sample billionaires. I could be completely wrong on this, but I suspect most of them had relationships reasonably early in life. Now, did the relationships work out? Different story. But I do think many of them would have gotten into relationships early. But the confounder there could just be that they were charismatic, determined, persistent, direct. So that could literally just be the confounder. So I don't know.
Yeah. I think relationships are very all-consuming for me. Yeah. It's very hard for them to not occupy so much of my heart and mind. And and
yeah, you just expanded your dating market.
I don't know if it could get any bigger. Just because the market's big doesn't mean the market share has been captured, though. Like, those are different things. If we only capture 0.1% of the market, we'll be billionaires.
I think the actual right answer here is it's just hard to plan. Like, we don't. Yeah. I actually think we just don't know.
Maybe there's a VC out there with good deal flow that would be willing to collaborate.
I know one or two.
Oh. If only.
If you're listening to this podcast,
If I send you deal flow, take the hit.
It's kind of funny because there's 5 people I know you send deal flow to.
Yep.
Oh man,
Could be any one of them.
you send Sam a deal flow as well.
That's what I'm saying. Could be any one of them. Sorry, Oliver.
Surely this is getting cut out.
Yeah, of course.
Sure. No, it's not an actual episode.
Yeah, it's not.
We're just testing the microphone.
Yeah, we're just testing the microphone.
How do I put self-driving on? It's a button somewhere, right? Is this actually going to drive itself?
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. No, it's on.
Is it?
Yeah.
Cool. Usually has that little rainbow thing.
I think it's because we're going slow, not moving.
Yep.
There we go. There
Nice.
goes the rainbow.
That could be a site.
Who's liable if it crashes? You, I'm presuming?
It would
Yeah,
be you.
surely. Yeah. That's what I mean. Wow. This was really a mistake. Getting into this traffic.
There's usually not that much traffic in that stuff.
Maybe because it's Saturday and a lot of people are up in like Marin and Sausalito chilling. Okay, shall we wrap the pod?
Yeah, that was kind of abrupt. For sure. I mean, what are your final thoughts?
Let's see if it's gonna. No way, it's gonna.
All right.
Holy shit!
I
the
turned it
Tesla
on
was
aggressive mode.
working out whether to run the red light, and it ran the red light. It was like halting and moving, and decided to do it. It drives like me. What are my final thoughts? It's. I don't know. I think that so much comes. I think like the answers often like we don't know, and we have to do everything well, and we have to spend time thinking and talking and doing, and we have to be perfectionistic and low fear. We need to be loving and self-critical. We need to be moving away from something and moving towards something. I just think many of these we need to be like autistic and highly socially calibrated. I just think many of these spectrums aren't actually spectrums, and language and conceptualization on top of that language has made us think they are.
We just need to like be to the maximum.
In other words, you can have kids and not have kids at the same time.
Everything's just
Particle on a
superposition.
wave. Yeah. Until you observe it.
Yeah. And then it's just autistic.
Oh man. And on that note,
yep, that's a wrap.
tuning out, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, just
Gentlemen.
gentlemen.